There are empty theaters all around the country. We are now at a 1 out of 10 on IMDb for the new Snow White, and it couldn't happen to a better person.
They called it the live-action revival that would change everything. After all, Snow White is the story that put Disney on the map back in 1937, charming audiences for nearly a century with a fairy tale romance, a kind-hearted princess, and 7 unforgettable dwarfs. But in 2025, that iconic fantasy was reimagined in ways so drastic that fans felt they'd stumbled into a fever dream. Now, people everywhere are asking, how did Disney get so wrong? There's talk of bungled reshoots, over-the-top budgets, an outspoken lead actress causing PR nightmares, and a film so alienating that its own merchandise might be disappearing from store shelves. The story of Snow White 2025 has become its own twisted fable, one starring controversy, speculation, and a shockingly empty box office. Buckle up, because the story unfolding here is unlike any fairy tale Disney ever told.
Yeah, we had more dwarfs than we did viewers in most of these theaters. And as you know, there were no dwarfs other than some CGI weird generated version of them.
Once upon a time, Disney decided to remake their oldest classic, hoping to enchant new audiences while cashing in on nostalgia. It seemed like a foolproof plan. The original Snow White was a symbol of innocence, perseverance, and timeless love. This time, however, audiences detected trouble far in advance. Rumors of the plot ditching the prince, overshadowing the dwarfs, and focusing on an entirely different moral arc started cropping up online. Whispers grew into outrage as alleged story leaks suggested that the essence of Snow White was getting lost in a messy rewrite, one that was less about whimsical storytelling and more about shoehorning empowering elements. Some fans were excited at first, hoping for a thoughtful update that honored the spirit of the original while modernizing a few dated aspects. But the moment paparazzi and industry insiders revealed that the dwarfs might vanish, replaced by magical woodland creatures or scattered CGI illusions, enthusiasm rapidly tanked. Even before the movie's official marketing began, a wave of skepticism took over social media. People questioned whether the modern approach could keep the heart of Snow White's innocence. And as it turns out, those early warnings were just the tip of an iceberg that Disney wasn't prepared to face.
Don't alienate half of the country when you're putting out a product meant to appeal to all. It's the Michael Jordan Republicans buy sneakers too.
In many ways, Rachel Ziegler symbolized a new era at Disney, a young, charismatic performer with a strong singing voice and a flair for social media engagement. She'd made waves starring in other big productions, building a reputation as a rising talent. But once she stepped into the iconic role of Snow White, the bright spotlight turned harsh. Ziegler found herself in repeated interviews discussing how Snow White 2025 would be a forward-thinking tale stripped of the love story. She openly criticized aspects of the 1937 original, calling them outdated. She insisted her portrayal would be no damsel in distress, and claimed that removing the prince's significance was crucial to emphasize Snow White's independence. While those comments might have worked if carefully framed, her tone often came off as dismissive, especially toward fans who cherished the original romance. On social media, critics argued that she was alienating a massive segment of Disney's core audience. She also dropped lines about wanting to be paid for every minute she wore the iconic dress, and openly vented frustrations about certain demographics not wanting to see progress. Before long, hashtags boycotting the film popped up, and the public's curiosity about Snow White 2025 quickly shifted to resentment toward its leading star. Then came the murmurings that Ziegler had labeled certain individuals in the entertainment industry as white supremacists, referencing tensions she allegedly experienced on a different set. Suddenly, headlines about Snow White were less about the fairy tale magic and more about the actress's polarizing stance. The talk show circuit buzzed, and so did Hollywood's rumor mill. Disney had a real problem on its hands, and Rachel Ziegler was at the center of it.
Her heroine cannot be in love or be saved by a man, the prince, that she's more focused on becoming the leader she was meant to be, as if women in modern day America must make that choice.
But a single star can't sink a ship this big on her own. The real trouble started with the script itself. Over time, word leaked out that Snow White 2025 went through multiple reshoots, some say 3, others claim 4, each tweak attempting to salvage disjointed plot lines. Initially, fans only suspected the dwarfs would be portrayed differently. Then, the entire notion of dwarfs seemed to fade away, replaced by a group of CGI illusions that hardly resembled the cherished companions from the past. Worse, the concept of Snow White as a solitary figure, no charming prince in sight, sparked furious debates. The classic story's romance had always been optional for some watchers, but it was also a hallmark that shaped generational beliefs about love, kindness, and hope. Removing that element meant recentering the plot on Snow White's ambitions as a leader, but many critics found the final product felt ham-fisted and unsubtle. One viewer described the atmosphere of the finished film as a random series of feverish scenes stitched together. Another claimed it was nearly impossible to tell which sections were original shoots and which were reshoots because everything felt like a patched job. Fans who might have accepted an updated storyline were distracted by the bizarrely empty background spaces where the dwarfs should have been, replaced by awkward CG. Instead of leaning into real comedic sidekicks or heartfelt moments, the film mostly showcased strange pacing and inconsistent dialogue that reeked of last-minute rewrites.
So, I mean, this woman has clicked every box. And just for cherry on top at the end, she gave an interview last week talking about how they were basically a bunch of white supremacists on the set of West Side Story.
Behind every Disney movie is an empire of merchandise, t-shirts, dolls, lunchboxes, and everything in between. Typically, a modern live-action remake triggers a tidal wave of store displays, limited edition collectibles, and elaborate marketing events. With Snow White 2025, though, rumors circulated that Disney secretly started pulling merchandise, or at least refused to commit to wide-scale distribution. Why such a strange move? Insiders claim that the negative press spooked top brass. Early test screenings produced lukewarm feedback at best, and as more of Rachel Ziegler's controversial remarks leaked, Disney allegedly minimized risk by toning down promotional efforts. The idea was, don't pour more money into marketing a film that might bomb. In the past, even if Disney faced shaky reviews, they'd rely on the iconic brand to push toys and tie-in products. But with Snow White, skepticism snowballed into near apathy. Social media was bursting with chatter about how nobody wanted to see it, fueling a wave of store cancellations. Posters quietly disappeared from certain retail outlets, and the synergy that usually lights up the Disney machine was nowhere to be found. For a film meant to celebrate one of Disney's crown jewels, it was an astonishing sight, a hush-hush marketing retreat orchestrated by a studio that once seemed unstoppable.
So she just encapsulates everything that most of us cannot stand about modern day feminism and the left in general, and Hollywood.
Every blockbuster has a threshold it must meet to succeed, and Snow White 2025 soared into blockbuster territory before it even hit theaters, just not in a good way. According to some analysts, the film's production budget alone topped $250 million, not counting marketing and reshoots. To break even, it would have needed a phenomenal box office run over multiple weeks. Instead, it faced an avalanche of negative attention. Once the dust settled on opening weekend, it was clear the crowds just weren't showing up. Photos emerged of empty theaters, and fans joked that there were more seats than viewers, some referencing how the dwarfs themselves were missing both on-screen and in the actual audience. Online reviewers tore apart the script, calling it disconnected, preachy, and an unintentional parody. Disney's top brass, including Bob Iger, tried to downplay the situation. In shareholder meetings, they emphasized that negative coverage was often overblown. Yet nobody could argue with the raw numbers. When your film opens to a fraction of its monstrous budget, there's no easy spin. Suddenly, gloom settled over Disney's headquarters, and talk of who approved all these changes spread like wildfire. Internal sources whispered about a brewing blame game. Marketing teams blamed creative leads blamed the top executives, and the star's public fiascos became a convenient scapegoat for everyone. That confusion only made matters worse as the film's financial hole grew deeper, overshadowing even the most loyal Disney defenders.
People have real problems, and no one gives a if she got paid for 17 instead of 18 on her multi-million-dollar salary, which is not calculated by the hour.
Social media can make or break a modern film. In the case of Snow White 2025, it nearly shredded it to pieces. Twitter threads called it one of the worst live-action adaptations ever, mocking specific scenes that felt randomly spliced together. Reddit discussions pointed out how the film's finale, complete with all-white outfits and an out-of-place dance number, seemed totally removed from any Snow White lore. Cringe compilations of Rachel Ziegler's interviews found a captive audience on YouTube, with watchers dissecting every eyebrow raise and offhand remark she made. Some even fixated on her repeated claims about pay disputes or how certain older fans simply didn't get it. Instead of stirring curiosity, it stirred resentment. For once, even typically forgiving Disney fans felt betrayed. Many said they'd grown up with Snow White, cherished the dwarfs and the classic romance, and were open to changes, just not misguided overhauls that appeared to dismantle everything magical. Longtime supporters turned their backs, demanding that Disney handle classic material with more nuance. If the creative team wanted to modernize, they should have done so in a way that still honored the story's heart.
If she hadn't have opened her mouth, I think that this movie might have done well. They might have just been able to ride on the hopium of the movie and some well-cut trailers, and people would have paid to go see it, and then it would have fallen off when people knew it was garbage.
According to Disney's PR statements, Snow White 2025 was a bold reimagining that aimed to remove the antiquated romantic tropes, focusing on a queen in training who doesn't rely on any rescue. It was supposed to reflect modern ideals and celebrate female leadership. At its core, that concept didn't have to be disastrous. Past remakes, like Maleficent or Cinderella 2015, adjusted classic tales while retaining enough of the original spirit to keep fans engaged. But critics say Snow White 2025 missed the mark by bulldozing key elements that gave the story its timeless soul. Instead of weaving independence naturally into a compelling plot, the adaptation apparently hammered its point home with graceless lines and lackluster storytelling. Rachel Ziegler's refusal to see value in the original love story only amplified the sense that the film looked down on the classic. By the time the final cut premiered, nobody knew which vision of Snow White they were watching: Disney's, the directors, or some last-minute hybrid jammed together by frantic studio heads. The big question remains, was there a version of this story that could have satisfied both progressive fans and tradition-loving viewers? Possibly. But the universal sentiment is that this particular attempt didn't do either side justice.
Bob Iger says their mission is to entertain, not send messaging as Snow White sales compete for worst performing live-action Disney adaptation ever.
So, where does that leave Snow White 2025 and Disney as a whole? The official narrative is that the studio is reassessing its approach to live-action remakes. Fans and critics alike are demanding more thoughtful, careful storytelling that respects the classics' core rather than gutting them just for contemporary points. The fiasco has forced a conversation about how overshadowing the original's magic can backfire, no matter how much money a studio pumps into production. Rachel Ziegler continues to double down, asserting that younger audiences need stories free from outdated messages. Yet the final numbers suggest that the masses, young, old, or somewhere in between, didn't buy what she and Disney tried to sell. Even some who embrace progressive changes found the finished film lacking in cohesion or heart. From empty theaters to pulled merchandise, from social media meltdowns to boardroom finger-pointing, this has become a cautionary tale for Hollywood. If a big studio decides to remake a beloved story, it must handle that legacy with care. Nostalgia can draw in enormous crowds, but it can also spark a fiery revolt when the final product seems to disrespect everything people once adored. Snow White 2025 is now etched into Disney history, not as the charming update executives hoped for, but as a glaring reminder that bold reimaginings can blow up if they forget the core principle, telling a story people actually want to see. The real question is whether Disney has learned its lesson for future adaptations, or if more fiascos are waiting in the wings. The final call lies with the fans, who've proven they won't accept a shallow revamp of a cherished fairy tale, no matter how glossy the visuals or how loudly the leading star defends it. After all, once the magic mirror cracks, it's hard to unbreak it.
She's now bragging about the success of Snow White, which is a movie that's going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars, and mainly because of her, and because nobody wanted to support her.